How Charlie Munger made Berkshire Hathaway successful. In 1929, a stock market crash occurred, which was so devastatingly hard that it caused a chain reaction, wiping out investments all over and causing complete panic on Wall Street. The savings of everyone from millionaires to janitors who'd recklessly poured them into stocks were eradicated on a day that was dubbed Black Thursday.
Well, I think Warren and I have come to tech like some newborn infant that's dragged there.
Shares ended up plummeting and portfolios were rendered completely worthless. That year, Charlie Munger was just 5 years old. He lived through one of the harshest periods that ever took place, but only a half a century later, he would have built the strongest business empire that humanity has ever seen. Berkshire Hathaway has, under the watchful eyes of Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett, become one of the biggest and most successful companies ever. And the story of Charlie Munger himself has emerged as one of the greatest business success stories in history. Created in the Depression, Charlie Munger, like his future friend Warren Buffett, was born in Omaha, Nebraska.
But those of you who are about to enter business school or who are there, I recommend you learn to do it our way, but at least until you're out of school, you have to pretend to do it their way.
It was 1924, and America was a very different place. It had been only 4 years since the time we recognize as the end of the American frontier, or Wild West era as it is commonly known. It was also just 8 years since the end of the First World War and 5 years before the Great Depression, in the Roaring Twenties, as they were known. Young Charlie's father, Alfred Case Munger, was a lawyer, and his grandfather was Thomas Charles Munger, who was a United States District Court judge and a state representative.
My paternal grandfather was the only federal judge in Lincoln, Nebraska, the capital city of Nebraska. And he was a brilliant man. He'd risen from nothing.
Even at a very young age, Munger had come to understand the fundamentals of capitalism, that if you want to make money, then you must provide something of approximate equal value. And this would go on to serve him well throughout his life. Of course, when he was just 5, he saw what could go terribly wrong when the Great Depression occurred in 1929.
Most of my schooling was in the Great Depression, but that means I'm one of the very few people that's still alive who deeply remembers the Great Depression. That's been very helpful to me. In those days, there were all kinds of people, most of my family, they believed in hard money based on gold and not much welfare and so on and so on. So that I was raised among fairly backward people by modern standards. But they were backward in kind of a self-reliant way that I think was helpful.
As a result of the immense financial devastation of the Depression, a third of all banks failed. Unemployment rose to 25% and homelessness was everywhere. The Depression was widely blamed on President Hoover, and those who had been forced to leave their homes lived in shanties known as Hoovervilles. Because of the Depression, Munger would have to start working at a young age, and so he got a job working at Buffett & Son, a grocery store that was owned by Warren Buffett's grandfather. He would work 12-hour shifts to make no more than $2, which at the time was not a bad salary. Munger was a bright boy with a thirst for learning and an aptitude for business, but what made him stand out was his work ethic and his fascination and appreciation for money. Forged in war. When he was of age, young Charlie enrolled in the University of Michigan.
The University of Michigan.
That's right, we're at the home of the Wolverines.
In order to learn about mathematics. He was a very driven young man with a heavy focus on what he wanted out of life, as opposed to following the perspectives of others. During his time at the school, he joined the Sigma Phi Society. But he would not be able to stay at college for the entire duration of his intended education because in 1941, war came once again to the American shores. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the war that had been raging across Europe, mostly between the British and Nazi Germany, came to America and forced many young men to leave school and trade their mortarboard for GI helmets. Munger was no different. He dropped out of college to serve in the U.S. Army Air Corps, where he would become a second lieutenant. During his training, he also met his future wife. Munger attracted the attention of his superiors because of his advanced IQ and was promoted to the position of meteorologist, analyzing upcoming weather patterns that could affect the American war effort. He would make weather maps denoting and illustrating predicted weather patterns. This gave him the skills and knowledge to think like a physicist, being able to think in terms of fundamentals and reject assumptions. This was yet another element of his knowledge base that would serve him exceptionally well in his career after the war. Back to school. When the war was over, Munger married his first wife, Nancy Huggins, and immediately after the service, he went to Harvard Law School to enroll. However, when he applied, the Dean of Admissions rejected Charlie because he had never completed an undergraduate degree. However, he came around after receiving a call from Roscoe Pound, who had been the former dean of the school and was also a friend of Munger's family. His father had, of course, been to law school before him, and so it was that Charlie would follow in his footsteps. Munger was an excellent student and, of course, graduated magna cum laude with a JD in 1948. Through it all, though, through the military and at college, Munger was an avid card player and he learned how to gamble, knowing when to hold and when to fold. He has reminisced about this, giving the wonderful quote, "What you have to learn is to fold early when the odds are against you." Or, if you have a big edge, back it heavily because you don't get a big edge often. Opportunity comes, but it doesn't come often, so seize it when it does come. After he had graduated, he was admitted to the California bar in 1949. He started on an above-average salary, making $275 a month. Everything seemed to be going well for Charlie, but what came next would challenge him like nothing else had yet. Life is pain. Life was going good for a few years, but since Charlie had married at the age of just 21, but now at the age of 29, and with 3 children, his marriage began to buckle. Divorce was inevitable, and even though in the 1950s it was still frowned upon, it was still a very effective way to ruin a young man's life, and so it did. Nancy took almost everything from Charlie, including his house and most of his money. Charlie was completely broke, and so he moved into a very small house and drove an old jalopy Pontiac. His daughter would occasionally ask him why he had such a terrible car, and he would answer, to discourage gold diggers. Still a smart man, Charlie was resourceful, capable, and had survived well enough so far. He could surely rebuild his life. Unfortunately, a year after his divorce, another tragedy struck. He was shocked to learn that his 9-year-old son Teddy had developed leukemia. Of course, it was still the 1950s and health insurance, not to mention cancer treatments, were basically non-existent. Charlie had no choice. He would take care of his other children, practice law, go to the hospital and visit Teddy, and then walk around on the streets of Pasadena, tears streaming down his cheeks. He was powerless, inert, and incapable of helping his beloved son. After a year-long battle where no one could help, Teddy passed away. He has never forgotten and has discussed the experience, saying that there's nothing worse than losing your child inch by inch. Broken-hearted, emotionally destroyed, and completely lacking any savings, having spent them all to try to save Teddy, he thought about what he could have done if he had the money to save his son. What if he could have paid for the best treatment in the world? What if he had been better prepared? These thoughts drove Munger, and he developed his philosophy: never feel sorry for yourself. Munger steeled himself. He didn't fall apart. He decided that if he was going to stop something like this from ever happening again, he would need to have true wealth. Why do we fail? Charlie Munger realized something after the tragedies had mangled his life. He knew that he would need something other than just a law career to become truly wealthy. He would need to own businesses. He realized that, for the most part, the wealthiest people in the world all owned businesses, sometimes even multiple businesses. It was when he was working as a legal aid for a transformer manufacturer in Pasadena that Munger realized he could take control of that company and make far more profit. He liked the company a lot. He liked the people and decided he would like to be associated with them.
I'm too damn shy. I just about to enter the freeway in Pasadena. I made a U-turn. I went back and I walked in and I said, well, I really like working for you guys. Just the kind of people I like to be associated with and I like to work for.
As an investor, he realized that he would have no choice but to downsize. It is much the same as how private equity works. Buy a company, fix it up, and sell it for a profit. He learned quickly that while others would invest in broken businesses, struggle, and often lose, he would find businesses that had strong potential, that could actually succeed and just needed a hand. However, he wouldn't make his first million that way. He would make it in real estate. The property boom. At the time, Los Angeles was growing rapidly. It was well on its way to becoming the second biggest city in America, and Munger knew that there was an opportunity that he could not afford to miss. Unlike in business, real estate offered a measure of control that would help to mitigate risk. He was advising a valued client on a real estate project at Caltech and decided to put $100,000 of his own money on the line to aid the project. He owned half the operation, and when it quickly sold out, he was able to make a 400% return on his investment. But he didn't stop at that. He immediately reinvested the money into more projects, all at the same time, and while the city began to grow, Munger made his first million quickly, with his fortune rising to $3 to $4 million in just a few years. All the time, of course, Munger was also holding down a steady job in law, which helped him to assure himself that he would survive any potential failed investment. Even though he had made the lion's share of his money from real estate, he stopped investing in developments after just 5 projects. He was now in a position to be able to make money without having to incur such huge debts. This is a textbook move for any good investor. Once they make their first million, they no longer need to take risks and can play it safer. Investing in an old friend, Munger opened a legal company, Munger & Company, with a friend and client in 1962. He got involved in market making, which allows buyers and sellers to trade through marketing to create liquidity. Once he began making a profit, he realized he could invest said profit into other companies in a similar style to a hedge fund manager. He invested only in small growth companies like car manufacturers and built a portfolio of them. This meant he had a volatile performance, but eventually it gave him an average return of almost 25%. Munger was a multimillionaire, and he would team up with his quirky investor friend Warren Buffett, whom he had known since Nebraska, to invest as a team. They started a little holding company called Berkshire Hathaway and invested in blue chip stamps. Because the company produced stamps that could be spent on goods, and many people would often forget about their stamps, the company had found a lucrative niche. However, an antitrust lawsuit by the Department of Justice against the company had forced them to offer more shares to the public, and this provided Munger and Buffett with just the opportunity they had been looking for. The world is yours. In 1971, the duo managed to own 13% of the company. Throughout the 70s, the company was making $100 million a year, and the duo would use that cash to invest in other companies. After making themselves board members of Blue Chip, the pair quickly gained control of the company. The 70s was a period of takeovers, and Munger and Buffett were no different. Buffett owned about 36% of Berkshire Hathaway and used that company to take over others. The pair would then use the cash from these companies to take over other companies. They invested in a candy shop called See's Candies, but when rival Stover Candies aggressively copycatted that company, the CEO relied on Charlie Munger to step in and take them down through legal means. Munger put together a team of lawyers and went to war against Stover. Stover backed off quickly, terrified of the combined might of Munger and Buffett. No one dared to go against them again. Berkshire Hathaway thrived, investing in company after company, including, famously, Coca-Cola. Munger had ensured that the company would be able to scale. Munger's small-cap investment style and Buffett's eyes on long-term investments have served them well, and today, Charlie Munger, along with his partner, owns stock in some of the biggest companies in the world. They've worked with Apple and Amazon because, of course, they have predictable cash flow. Munger has had a long life and has been able to live extremely well. Now, at just a couple of years away from 100 years old, he can say that he has learned some of life's greatest lessons. By never giving up, making smart, calculated decisions, and ensuring that he mitigates risk, he has become one of the richest and most successful businessmen in the world. To anyone who is interested in the world of investment, you truly cannot look for a better role model than Charlie Munger.